Hey, in this tutorial I'm gonna explain and show you how to use the enhanced input system. We're gonna create a function to add the mapping context in an easier way, and if you use a gamepad I will show you an important fix, so the sensitivity is no longer influenced by the frame rate. First, I want to show you in the project settings where we usually added inputs. Going here to input, and there we can see the warning that axis and action mappings got deprecated and we should use enhanced inputs instead. So I'm here in the third person template because it has some enhanced input implemented, so I can use that to just show you how the system works. So if we take a look here in the third person input folder, first of all you can see here an input mapping context, data asset, and a folder called actions, including some actions like jumping, looking, or moving. So these actions have different types. For example, jumping, if we open that, you can see here the type is a bool. That's because it's just like, for example, for jumping, you only have to press spacebar. So it's either you're pressing it or you're not pressing it. So bool. So on or off. If we take a look here, for example, for moving, that's an axis 2D. So it's a value from, we have, for example, also axis 1D, so value from 0 to 1, or axis 2D is also from 0 to 1, but in two different axes. And then you can see here, we have some triggers. So if you don't have any triggers selected, then it's triggering all the time you're pressing the button. But you can add, for example, a trigger and say hold, for example, saying you have to press the button for at least 1 second until it triggers. So in this case, the character would start running if we're holding down, for example, W. Would have to hold it down for a second until the character starts running. And you also have other triggers in here. You can add also some modifiers. So as I said, the axis is, for example, here from 0 to 1. And we could also negating this. So from 0 to -1. So these are some default triggers and default modifiers that count for the whole input action. And if we're going now to the mapping context, opening that, then you can see here it contains these input actions. So for example, jumping, you can see here different keys are defined when it should trigger this input action. Or here for moving. And if I take a look here, for example, opening the key A, then you can see here you can also add some triggers and modifiers, like here. So here you're adding like default triggers and modifiers, while here you can add them specific for keys, which makes sense for like axis and moving, because like then you can say when pressing A it should be negated, so it should be a movement to left because the axis goes then from 0 to -1, while pressing D it should not be negated, so the axis would go from 0 to 1, so then you would move right. So as you can see here, you have some compared to the input system before, you have some more options with these modifiers and triggers. So it's a lot more advanced. Next, I'm going to open the third person character to show you how they implemented the enhanced input system in there. So first of all, we can see here some input action events, jumping, moving, we know them. And they get triggered when we're pressing the key that is defined here in the mapping context. And the second condition is that the mapping context must be added. So it doesn't need to be added to this specific character. It just needs to be added to the enhanced input system. And this one here is part of the player controller. So what you can see here, the casting to player controller, getting the enhanced input system and adding the mapping context to it. And yeah, I have two feelings about that. First one, it is very, very great that like all inputs are now managed in the player controller, because like before or in the old input system, it was like the character and the player controller had like individually input systems. So if you're pressing, for example, saying pressing spacebar in the character and doing something, and pressing spacebar in the player controller, then the player controller was overwriting the input and only triggered then in the player controller, and the spacebar input in the character was just not working anymore. And that changes now with this enhanced input system. So if we're taking, for example, the here input action jump, if you have that in the like this node, if you have this in the character and in the player controller, and you're then pressing this button, that's also, for example, jump here, spacebar, then this function will be triggered on both, on the character and the player controller. So that's very nice that we don't have this overwriting stuff anymore. And another thing, yeah, my more negative feeling about that here is like comparing that to the old input system, you didn't have to do this stuff on event begin play, like this setup here, and this here just looks a bit confusing. So also wondering why you have to do this casting stuff and why they didn't just provide an easier node to add a mapping context. And that's why I show you now how you can actually replace this stuff with a single function to just add a mapping context. And yeah, I will show you now how to create this function. I'm going back to the content browser and creating here a new folder that I call input. And in there, I'm adding a new blueprint function library. Calling this bfl underscore input functions. Then opening this, here you can already create a new function. I'll call this EasyAddMappingContext. And by the way, because this is a function library, all functions that we create in here, we can just call in any blueprint. So everywhere we are able to call the functions that we're adding to function libraries. But let's get back to this function here. So I'm getting here player controller and first check if that is valid. Getting this is valid node here. Then from the get player controller, I'm getting here the enhanced input local player subsystem and checking as well if that is valid. Connect this with the is valid pin. And then from this enhanced input local player subsystem pin here, search for add mapping context. Connect this with the is valid. Connect the mapping context, just drag this on the first node here. So it creates automatically this input here. I'm holding down Alt to remove this here. Just for that it looks better here, the blueprint more organized. Getting here from the mapping context now, get mapping context. So if we do this or this is basically the same thing. So yeah, just a bit more clean. Then we also want to duplicate this function here, because we made now a function to add a mapping context, but we also want to have a function to remove a mapping context. So I just duplicated this function here and renamed it to easy remove mapping context. And the only node we need to change here is the add mapping context. So I'm searching from the enhanced input node here, remove mapping context, and connecting this here. Also connecting the mapping context value here. And if we go now to the third person character, first I will disconnect this here from the event begin play. If we would play now, I don't have any input here, cannot look around or walk around or this kind of stuff. Yes. So instead of this now here, where we are calling or adding the IMC default mapping context, I can just call now the function that we created, EasyAddMappingContext. Selecting here the IMC default, and now playing, and it's working. So that's a lot easier to do than this. And another thing, also in my opinion, this whole adding a mapping context as it is done, or as this enhanced input system is already managed in the player controller, it's also not necessary to call it in the character to make use here of these enhanced input events. So what I want to say is that you don't need to add it to add a mapping context to the character, and instead I like it more to add it directly to the player controller. So I delete all of this here, and checking here in this map where we have our player controller, going here to the world settings. Here, if you cannot see them, enable them here. And under game mode, we have here player controller class. This is the default player controller, so it's just named here player controller. But I will create a new one, and yeah, I will just call it BP tutorial PC. Or if you have already a player controller, that's also fine, and then you should use this, not creating a new one. So I created now this player controller here, and also double checking that it is selected here. And here on event begin play, I will just call now the EasyAddMappingContext. Yeah, and then you see it works. Okay, next I want to show you how you can actually create your own input actions and your own mapping context. So I'm going here to the inputs folder, and under input, adding a new input action. Calling this IA_, and now think, what should this action be for? let's say crouch. So I'm calling it like this, opening this. But before we adjust the values in here, let's go to the third person character and search here for this newly created input action. II crouch, here we have it. Choose this one. So this node is not working yet because we only created the input action, but we need to implement it in a mapping context. Let's do that next, going back. So there is already, going here to the player controller, there is already this IMC default mapping context that comes with the third person template. You can, of course, just add this IA crouch in there. Or, yeah, in this tutorial, I will just create a brand new mapping context. So I'm right clicking here and on the input, selecting here input mapping context. Calling this IMC tutorial. So, and here we can add mappings and choose here this IA crouch. And there you can already see we can select the key that should trigger it. So I'm clicking this keyboard icon here, and then we can press the key on the keyboard. I choose left control. You can also add more keys if you want to, for example, add controller like gamepad inputs. And yeah. Now let's go to the player controller, because I said it makes sense to keep everything organized, adding all the mapping context inside of the player controller. Yeah, here we're adding the IMC default already. And now I'm calling another one, EasyAddMappingContext, and choosing here the IMC tutorial. Now let's go back to our character, where this node now should work. So because crouching is super simple, let's just quickly implement it. We only need to check in our character movement if crouch is enabled. So can crouch, I'll tick that. And then on started, I can call crouch. And on completed, I can call uncrouch. If we play now, you can see we're holding down left control, camera goes down, releasing it again, camera goes up. So the character is now crouching. There is no animation, of course, but yeah, I guess for this tutorial is enough. And you see that we can go in this state and leave it again. If we take now a look in this input action, then we see here the value type is a digital bool. So a bool, so it can be either on or off, like true or false. That is already perfect for crouching because we have these two states, crouching or not crouching. So when we're holding down the key, it enters the state. And when we stop holding down the key, like releasing the key again, yeah, it also goes uncrouch again. So digital bool is perfect already. But if we click on that, you can see we have also other value types. For example, axis 1D or axis 2D. Axis 1D would be, for example, for if you want to move forward, backwards, and having like a range, like a float. Like if you're pressing W on your keyboard, it is 1, and if you press S, it should be -1. And if you're having a gamepad and moving the joystick, it also could then be the values in between. Like axis 2D then would be then for moving forward, backward, left and right, and 3D, yeah, maybe also for if you want to fly, moving up and down. But for all the other interactions, like bool is perfect, like for the one-shot interactions or just where you entering a state and leaving it again. And next we have the triggers, and for that you can go back here. This is this pin, and currently it's not perfect actually, or it's not the proper way, because it's triggering here when we're holding down the key. It's triggering all the time, constantly, every tick, as long as we stop or releasing the key again. So what you can do is adding here, you can also do it like this, that worked already, but if you want to do it perfect, then you can add here triggers and add here a pressed. So if you have only added pressed now, that means if we're pressing left control now, it would trigger here one time. It would also trigger started one time, and it would also trigger completed one time. So started and completed, in this case, we both would not need them. So yeah, this setup would like pretty much only be using only the trigger pin if you have one-shot interactions or so. Yeah, but you can also add here a released, and then we can connect this here with triggered, because then the triggered will be one time, firing one time, and the completed will then also fire one time once we release this one here. So it's a bit advanced. But if we try this now, it's working the same way. So now let's also have a quick look on the implementation for the third person template for movement. So here you can look how you could implement movement with the new enhanced input system. Also check for that here the third person input IMC default folder, and then you can check here how they set everything up here. So if you remember, in the old system you had like these two nodes for like moving forward, backward, and another node for moving left, right. They put it here now in a single node. That's probably in the end the cleaner way. So you can, as I said, look how they made it, but you still have the possibility to do it also in two nodes. So one for move forward, backward, and another node for left, right. That's easier to set up. I guess I will also do a separate tutorial about that. And now let's take a look on the camera input. So for looking around, because what Unreal provided here for looking around for this input, it has a problem. So first of all, if you only have like mouse input, that is totally fine. But if you also want to look around with the gamepad or with a controller, then you have a problem, because if you have less FPS, then it's slower to look around, and the more FPS you have, the faster it is to look around. So these values are then for gamepad input frame rate, influenced by the frame rate, and of course you don't want that. So as I said, for mouse this is fine, but for controller you need, or for a gamepad, you need to multiply these values with the world data seconds, and then also with another float value, which then defines the sensitivity of looking around. However, if you just do that now here, then it would be good for gamepad looking around, but you would kind of destroy again how it worked with looking around with the mouse. So if we're looking here to IMC default, how they made it here for input action look, they put it both in here, mouse and gamepad. And yeah, that doesn't work that they are both in there because, yeah, what I just explained. So you need to separate it. You need to add another mapping, and we'll just go to the look here, duplicate this, calling this IA look mouse, and this existing one IA look gamepad. Okay, we got some problems here. We have here the gamepad, and here we have the look mouse. I'm selecting here or searching here for mouse X, Y, 2D axis. Yeah, they added also a modifier here. So I'm checking that I make it the same, negating the value here, and removing then from this gamepad input action the mouse. So we now have two separate, one for gamepad, one for mouse. Going back to the third person character, you can see here now enhanced input action IA look. This should be updated or not. Do we have still a look? Actually, this should already be the new input action. I don't know why it's not called IA look gamepad. So I'm searching here for a look gamepad, splitting this, removing this basically, connecting this like so. Yeah, before we do that, I will duplicate also this one and replacing this here with the look mouse. Splitting this value. So I can call this mouse. As I said, for mouse, it's perfect already. For gamepad, I would show you this small adjustment now. There, you could now multiply this value with the word delta seconds and promote this here to a variable, create a new float. I'm calling this gamepad look rate, or maybe look sensitivity, you can also call it. So I'm duplicating these three nodes here, or like copying and pasting them here to also do the same for, basically do the same for the Y value, also multiplying this with the word delta seconds and the gamepad look rate. Then, yeah, you could adjust this look rate here, how it feels then right with gamepad. Okay, a small test. If I implemented the fix correct, I can look around and run around very good with gamepad, and with mouse I can see like up and down I can look correct, but left and right it is negated. So let me quickly correct what I just told you. So here under IA look mouse, I added the modifier negate, which is correct, but it should be only for the y-axis, so removing x and z. So final test. Yeah, my mouse movement is now good again, and I hope I helped you with this tutorial. And yeah, some final words. and we could have made the system a bit easier to use. Nevertheless, it is a very great system with more and advanced possibilities, and that's also very nice.